All right, welcome everyone, and on behalf of Frontier View, thank you for joining our webinar series. On today's webcast, we will be diving into the aftermath of the US election. We'll be taking a deep dive into where things stand today, domestic policy and priorities under a Biden presidency, and foreign policy and priorities under a Biden presidency, all through the lens of how to best prepare your global business. My name is Richard Leggett, and I'm the CEO of Frontier View, and I'll be moderating this discussion, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ryan Connelly, Frontier View's chief economist. Ryan and I would like this to be a highly interactive discussion, so please be sure to click on the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen and send your questions to Frontier View webinars, and we will work to get as many questions included in the discussion as possible. Also, as a reminder, if you are a client, you can access Ryan's research and all of our market intelligence research and data on your Frontier View desktop and mobile applications simply by logging on. If you're not a client, for registered attendees of this webinar, we're offering complimentary trial access to Frontier View. To take advantage of this offer, please request a trial in the comment box or simply visit our website at www.frontierview.com and click the request trial button. Before we get started, we realize that some of you may be new to Frontier View, so I'd like to take a minute to provide you with a quick overview of our firm and how we support multinational executives. Frontier View is a premier global market intelligence and advisory firm, and our primary focus is on serving the market intelligence needs of global business professionals at multinational corporations by informing and empowering their market monitoring, strategic planning, and international growth priorities. From the beginning, we built Frontier View to be different in three primary ways. First, our product and service model has been purpose-built to serve a global business audience. In every aspect of our work, we strive to separate signal from noise and answer what we call the so what, now what questions that are unique to the international business professional. Second unique feature of Frontier View is our model. We call it Strategic Intelligence as a Service, and what it means is that Frontier View is the only market intelligence solution that bundles together information resources, analyst advisory access, and senior executive network events such as this one. Finally, we are especially proud of our world-class technology, which powers the Frontier View desktop and mobile application, and really has been built with the sole purpose of informing our clients' workflows and decision processes. We're incredibly proud of our client base, which today includes a community of over 4,000 and is growing, some of which you see here represented by the logos. And again, if you're not a client and are interested in receiving trial access to our Frontier View program, please visit our website and click the request trial button. I could go on, but let me just move right into introducing Ryan, our speaker. Ryan Connelly is Frontier View's chief economist, and he leads our global economics team. Ryan's also responsible for coordinating the views and forecasts globally of our research analysts, and he also covers the North America market for Frontier View clients. Ryan, thanks for joining today.
Hey, Rich, thank you for having me, and thanks everybody who's dialed in.
I'd like to, if we could, Ryan, break our discussion into maybe three main segments, if you will. First, I think we should just take a status check of where things currently stand and what we expect will happen next with the US elections. And then secondly, let's deep dive into US domestic policy under a base case Biden presidency. And then third, let's do a quick around the world tour and dive deep region by region into foreign policy priorities and implications for multinationals. Does that sound like a good agenda for us?
Yep, that sounds perfect to me.
All right, so let's get started with where we stand today. And I know when we first scheduled this call, we weren't sure if we would have any clear answers, but it seems like we're getting some clarity. And in fact, just overnight, it looks like Georgia officially has been declared for President-elect Biden. So give us a quick status check of where we are. Are we any closer to President Trump potentially conceding and beginning the transition? You know, give us your update.
Sure. So as we looked at the election prior to November, we basically sorted out the national election outcomes into three major buckets. And this is from the report at the time. We're basically concerned about who wins the presidential election, and that's going to be your vertical bar, and then who wins the Senate, which is your horizontal bar. At the time when we wrote the report, we had no expectations that the House was at risk, and indeed the Democrats have taken back the House. As far as the election went, a bit of a mixed bag for Democrats who, in the immediate month or two prior to the election, saw a really big surge in in polling numbers suggesting the potential of a blue wave, which really didn't transpire. So what we saw instead was basically Biden secure the election with relatively narrow but conclusive majorities in many of the key swing states that we expected he would carry. And I'll show you the map of that in a second. But as far as the Senate went, the Senate, back in March, April, May, there really didn't seem to be any likelihood that the Democrats would take the Senate. As the polls widened, as the economy grew sort of worse, as coronavirus spread throughout the country, the Senate looked increasingly in play for Democrats. And so we sort of thought that was more of a toss-up scenario, but leading pollsters going into the election thought it would be like 52 to 54 seats for the Democrats, taking a majority against a minority of the Republican Senate. And what we're seeing now is that Democrats underperformed in their Senate elections. Polling was very far off again. And so at this point, the Democrats have 48 seats to 50 seats for the Republicans, with two critical elections occurring in December and January for Georgia. Those seats will both go to runoff elections, and that could determine the sort of swing of the Senate to a very mild Democratic majority. I think we're going to talk a bit more about that in a moment, but from a fundamental perspective, even if Democrats win both Georgia seats, which seems unlikely, we don't actually think that will have a major impact on the ability for the Biden team to get a lot of legislation done. And so what we're going to be left with is a Biden administration facing a very extremely narrow or even Republican Senate that will mainly have to rule through administrative action. Just to look at the election map for 1 second. This is the map as it currently stands. Georgia is a question mark as to whether or not that fully goes to Democrats. Biden is up, but it's a very narrow majority. North Carolina, I think that one should be decisively called for the Republican Party. The rest of the blue states are states that Biden has won. The red circles are states that where Biden won states that had been won by Trump in 2016. So Biden's path to victory was effectively carving out victories in some of these Rust Belt economies in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where Hillary Clinton lost Donald Trump by relatively narrow margins, as well as flipping Arizona. And that was basically how our election outcome was designed, was winning sort of this blue wall, as they call it, back, as well as picking up Arizona, where demographics polling data pretty clearly showed Biden sort of up months ahead of the election. Georgia was a surprise if it goes Biden, but I think there are particular factors to that race that made it distinct from Florida and North Carolina.
Yeah, and I should point out, Ryan, way back in April, you established this base case of Biden winning the presidency and the Republicans holding the Senate. And congratulations on that, because that was a really early time to be sticking your neck out for that. All eyes have turned now, as you mentioned, to Georgia for the Senate runoff, and that'll happen in early January. Probably never will more money be spent in the days leading up to this runoff. And I think we're all fatigued by election stuff, but I guess we have to endure it through the new year. But we did see a massive mobilization effort in Georgia for the presidential election. And you stated that you expect the Republicans to win at least one of the seats and retain control of the Senate. That's your base case. What gives you this confidence, and what probability would you place on this outcome?
So I think the likelihood of both Georgia seats going to Democratic candidates is pretty low. We're talking maybe 20 to 25%. There's a few reasons I say that. Number one, as you mentioned, there was an extremely effective voter mobilization campaign carried out by the Democratic Party, Stacey Abrams being sort of the figurehead of that, with a lot of money flowing through pretty efficient grassroots organizing programs to really mobilize voting in and around Atlanta, as well as through the rest of Georgia. But really, it was the urban votes in Atlanta that ended up carrying this for Biden. I think it's going to be hard to repeat that in December and January for a couple of reasons. The first one being, in Georgia, what we've seen is high mobilization numbers were the way that you were able to achieve a mild Democratic victory. And that tends to be the case in a lot of states, though it's not in every state, but higher mobilization tends to benefit Democrats. Republican voters just sort of tend to be more likely to vote even in sort of state and local elections. And because that runoff election for the Senate is just going to be for the Senate and not a kind of up or down vote on Donald Trump, I think you're just going to see a little bit less mobilization as a result of that. That's number one. Number two, very important in Georgia as well, is going to be the sort of suburban, sort of middle class vote. And a swing of 2 to 4 percentage points in any of those sort of suburban votes will be very important. And I think that Republicans have a very effective message for going at those Atlanta suburbs, some of which probably switched to Biden voters this time due to personal dislike of the president's style, President Trump, that is. And Georgia Republicans can go and say, look, Biden has won the presidency. What we want to prevent is the radical left from being able to legislate by controlling the Senate. So even if you voted for Biden, let's just get a Republican Senate to sort of tie the hands of the far left and force compromise legislation to take place. And I think that's going to be a very effective pitch to sort of moderate sort of swing voters in Georgia. And also you've got to win both seats, right? And one of the Republican toss-up seats was closer than the other. And if you actually take away the independent votes that stripped the Republican from some votes that likely go his way, he would have won this without a runoff. And so for those three reasons, I basically think that Georgia's unlikely to see both seats tip towards the Democrats. And again, even if it does, you're talking about the most narrow majority that could possibly exist. So I doubt it's a good platform for a ton of legislation by the Democrats.
Okay. But before we move on to domestic policy, I just had a couple of quick other ones just in this intermediate period, this transition period. Since the election, we've seen COVID cases spiking parabolically, and we've also seen very little leadership out of the current administration. Two questions along these lines. First is, how likely is it that we're heading back to a March, April-like lockdown, and what could that mean for the economic progression that we've seen in the United States? And then secondly, is there any chance of a stimulus during this lame duck period, which seems to have faded to the background here? So is there a chance, and if so, what could that look like?
Yeah. So I think those are excellent points. I mean, during the election period is when we started to see these case numbers really break out. And because so much election noise was occurring, it really got downplayed. And as you know, parabolic is the right word. I mean, cases are spiking in every single state in the country right now. Some are seeing their worst outbreaks, especially in most of the Middle West. And some are seeing, like urban areas in the Northeast, their largest waves since they effectively got the disease under control back in April and May. We're going to see shutdowns. Chicago already announced a dining ban. Other states are proceeding to announce various forms of new restrictions sort of taking place. You're going to see a sort of similar bifurcation between red states that want to preserve the ability for individuals, households, businesses to make their own choices, much more than democratic states where they tend to be more urbanized. It's harder to control viral spread. But look, I think that we've learned a lot more about how to deal with the virus and what the policy priorities are in that interim period. And so I think taking examples from elsewhere, it seems more likely to me that states prioritize keeping schools open where they've reopened in lieu of keeping restaurants open, which was what New York originally tried to do. But it's very hard to go back to second sort of state lockdowns without more fiscal money available to support small businesses that are losing revenue or forced to close or operate with less hours or less capacity. And so I think that question about subsequent fiscal policy coming down the pipeline to help households and individuals and firms is really the sort of dominant question in my mind. The prospects for a new round of stimulus have sort of ebbed and flowed. When the initial sort of large unemployment assistance program ended in early August, expectations on Wall Street especially, as well as most economic forecasters, were that you would immediately see a second round of stimulus due to the pre-election politics and the underlying economic damage being done by COVID. that economic damage really didn't come in the way that economists expected in August and September. And I think we're seeing reasons why. The main one being vulnerable households largely saved the money that was distributed under those fiscal plans and started to use those savings to bridge financing for the next 2 to 3 months. But we've seen some signs of savings rates depleting, especially for low income households. And so that risk of a sort of big contraction in consumer spending is still a risk just due to inability to pay. In terms of COVID lockdowns, obviously, people will just have the ability to go to restaurants, bars, which is high expenditure areas, will just stop because you can't go out and enjoy yourselves. And so we'll see consumer spending fall from that. We've already seen credit card data start to slow down in these sort of COVID hotspots. But the fiscal stimulus is really needed, especially because further unemployment assistance that was exceptional ends on December 31st. And so Mitch McConnell came out after the election and said that he was willing to pass a sort of narrow fiscal stimulus, really designed around money to states for hospital and COVID-based expenditures, checks to individuals, and then probably an extension of the small business program, which is pretty wildly popular on both sides of the aisle. What he wants to strip out is all the additional types of assistance that Democrats are trying to put in. So the disagreement between Republicans and Democrats was basically, Democrats started at a $4 trillion proposal. Republicans started more like a $1 trillion proposal. And they were getting close to meeting in the middle around 1.8 trillion right before the election, with McConnell effectively holding the Senate for at least the next 3 months, if not longer. I think that you're going to have to get a sort of much more skinny stimulus of about 1 to 1.5 trillion. Even politically, that might not make the case, but we would expect that to happen basically sometime within the next 3 months before that December 31st expiry date, ideally.
Okay, good. That would be helpful. And let's hope there's the institutional leadership to make it happen. Let's shift now to domestic policy priorities, assuming a Biden presidency. And I want to not only talk about policies, but specifically implications to multinationals, to our clients, if you will. So if I stay with stimulus as kind of a top agenda item, what can we expect then on this front, and how quickly can we expect something, whether it's a step 2 of what you've just described, or the full program once Biden is sworn into office?
Yeah. So first thing I should note, it's a question we're still getting, especially from multinational clients outside the U.S. Biden has declared victory. It is very clear to us that Biden has won the election by margins large enough that Trump's legal appeals will not overturn the election results in his favor. Trump has not conceded victory. That's certainly not his style. And he's still pursuing court cases, although his court cases have been wildly, I think he's 0 for 12 in cases so far. So in our mind, Biden has been elected, and we really don't see any risk of a transition to Biden in January on Inauguration Day. Despite the noise that Trump is generating in the media, we're very confident that Biden is going to take office. So again, with the stimulus topic, the issue with the Republican-held Senate, the Republicans hold the Senate through January on Inauguration Day, when the Senate changes to the new Senate. And that new Senate is based on the elections just held. There's a possibility that Democrats try to hold out for the Georgia race before passing a narrow stimulus. But again, that means that you would get no stimulus until February, after the new Senate's taken sort of roost, and then you have to pass legislation. There's a big risk in that, which is that the economy is looking like it's going to worsen over the next few months as COVID cases spike, states enter lockdowns, and then we're entering the winter, where we knew we were going to have a sort of reversal of this sort of outdoor dining experience, which has brought back local services demand across a lot of urban cities in the Northeast. So I think if McConnell and Nancy Pelosi in the House and Senate, Democrat and Republican sides, basically say, we need a package because we know things are getting worse, I think Democrats kind of have to swallow a skinny package being offered by McConnell, and then they can just place their hopes that if the Georgia election is different, they can add supplemental fiscal spend. So I think I'm still a little bit more optimistic on this matter. The second thing is that I think the Republicans' plan and the Democrats' plan to a degree is everything's about Georgia right now through that Georgian election. And so I think that Republicans blocking or Democrats blocking stimulus, especially if the economy starts to turn a bit sour, COVID cases spike, states shut down without assistance for small businesses, no one looks good. And so I actually think that a targeted package that allows both parties to claim victory over that might be the right approach to take. So I'm actually a bit more optimistic of a fiscal package than I think most are.
That's good, because you're usually not too optimistic. So
It's true.
We saw significant deregulation occurring during the Trump years, and that ranged from environmental and climate related deregulation to business, financial, really across the board. What can we expect with a Biden presidency on the regulatory front, and which sectors are likely to either benefit the most or potentially take steps backwards from that perspective?
Yeah. So I think we can look at this three different ways. We'll look at the map in a second as well, because there's really big subnational implications for the US about a Biden versus Trump presidency when it comes to agency implementation of policy priorities. Looking back at the scenarios, our base case was effectively what's happening here, and we'll go into it, but basically it's going to be a presidency in which policy has to be implemented by executive authority and through administrative reinterpretation of legislation. So that's regulatory policy. Because Biden lacks a Democratic Senate, he really can't pass anything in the way of significant legislation. That would be the kinds of things that this election was about on the policy side. So corporate tax cuts, which was a Democratic priority, corporate tax increases was a Democratic priority. Raising the minimum wage nationally was a Democratic priority. Raising high-income household taxes was a Democratic priority. None of those can happen without legislation. And so what we're left with is not this kind of, for a lot of multinationals, and a very concerning scenario of potentially very progressive sweeping legislation in the US, including things like new reforms to the healthcare system, really, really onerous climate change, sort of regulatory changes. We're in a very different scenario with a Republican Senate. And what it's going to look a lot like is the way that Obama was forced to implement his own policy priorities during the later years of his presidency when he faced a hostile Congress. And in a lot of ways, what Trump faced in the last 2 years of his presidency, where he had a hostile House. So this comes from our electoral report, so we're not going to read all the text on the screen. But effectively, what we're looking at here is a restrictive regulatory environment. So I think day one, you're going to see this Biden team, once installed, come into power and basically take as a playbook all of the different deregulatory moves that the Trump administration took in the past 4 years. Basically go back through the Federal Register, scour for changes, and just reverse them. There were at least 135 deregulatory sort of moves made in the energy sector alone. That made it easier to burn off nat gas off of shale wells, which makes it much cheaper to extract. Various things about how much lubricating material you can insert in the wells, safety checks on pipelines, things like that. I mean, all of that I think will be very rapidly reversed. That's going to raise costs on the energy sector. At the same time, those cost increases in the energy sector are coming at the exact same time that oil field services costs are very low due to relatively weak demand for new drilling. So I think in the short term, a lot of this stuff is actually a push. In the long term, maybe you're raising your break-even rates for extraction on the margins, but for most parts of the energy sector, I don't think it's determinative to the long-term future, these kinds of regulatory policy changes. The government's going to keep making changes to try to make the grid more efficient, more smart, and more based on renewables over fossil fuel. We're already seeing the shift away from coal-based power simply because it's not fuel efficient, in the sense that coal is dirty and coal is not nearly as cheap as compared to natural gas, which remains very, very inexpensive. Then natural gas-fired plants are just better both for sort of baseload generation as well as peaking. So even though Trump tried to get the coal industry back to life, it didn't work, mainly because the advantages for the US from that gas production are just so present. But the Biden administration is going to put additional policies in place to disincentivize dirty fuel usage. So the coal industry is going to, if there was any optimism there after 4 years of Trump, which again, rhetorically there was, but in reality that didn't translate into massive benefits for the coal industry, that optimism is going to fade immediately with a Biden push towards cleaner sources of fuel. And so I really think that as far as it goes, the most obvious areas of immediate legislation will be re-regulating the economy, especially on the energy sector in the pursuit of a greener agenda, and as well as immigration, in which the president has a lot of authority to encourage various forms of restarting legal immigration, making it easier for H-1B sort of skilled visas to get processed, making sure that programs that facilitate legal visa processes for low-income workers that are necessary for a lot of services economies are actually being processed, as well as, and it's also needed for construction, by the way, which is a bottleneck in large parts of the country, and probably restarting some refugee resettlement programs, though those are never that large, and is mainly a political football more so than a real concern from a sort of economic policy perspective.
Okay, interesting. Infrastructure investment has been stated a priority, dating all the way back to, I think, when President Obama was even campaigning, and yet we've seen very little movement or true investment. Do you think this is likely to change? Biden's talked a lot about that as well. Will we see some movement there? Meanwhile, here we are years and years later, our infrastructure continues to crumble in the country. Will this be a priority? And if so, what areas are most likely to be prioritized?
So I think that Republicans and Democrats are going to try to find something to do in the first year to pass some sort of legislation, because they don't want to be sitting ducks, because I think in a lot of ways, the next 2 years is Biden basically interviewing to the American people for the right to legislate. And so he wants to get something done, and he wants to show that he can work across the aisle to get things done for the country. Senate Republicans, to some degree, will want to block legislation, but I think that things like infrastructure, there's wide national need for infrastructure in the US. As you said, multiple studies have shown that US infrastructure is well beyond the replacement point, and we need new investment into roads, bridges, but also things like upgrading the power grid. So I think infrastructure is a possibility for joint action if it's constructed in a way that allows for both Democrats and Republicans to claim that their priority segments are being addressed. So that's going to mean, aid, and in a lot of ways, this can actually tap into a green agenda as well. So looping in things like subsidies for improving power grids across the country to make it more operable with inconsistent sources of power generation like wind, which has actually become pretty popular in large parts of the Midwest. The ability to finance grants for sort of small and medium farms, as well as large farms, to sort of generate local power off of wind, I think is another place. Biden has long wanted to make transport within the Northeast corridor from Boston to DC quicker and more efficient via train and more efficient road systems. That's an expensive proposition. And so while I think you might see some expanded investment into rail networks in the Northeast as part of a large national compromise infrastructure bill, if it comes to bear, I think it'll be tough to see the kind of investment that you need for rapid transit that you'd see in Europe or Japan. But also just support for sort of local construction across the country into, as we sort of mentioned, yes, roads and bridges, which are in disrepair in large parts of the country, and water infrastructure as well, which we've seen crumble in parts of the Midwest. Also spending for irrigation and efficient pumping systems for Midwestern and West Coast farmers. So there's a ton of different priorities that if you can really get everyone in the room, you might be able to get a compromise package. I think the concern here is there's two. One is it's going to be basically what you call a pork-filled bill. So everybody's going to have to get their taste. There won't be a broad national message about what the bill means. Biden will say it's Build Back Better, and that will be a very large number of different priorities. That would be the first problem with it. The second problem is if Republicans decide to try to stop Democratic spending by turning towards a more sort of anti-debt, sort of pro-austerity Republican Party that we've seen them do in the past when Democrats take control. So we saw them do that under Obama in like 2012. And we also saw it happen under Clinton back in the 90s. It tends to be Republicans' response when Democrats take power. So they spend freely when Republicans are in office, and then they tighten the purse strings when Democrats are in office. The question is, will they resist that temptation long enough to get a big infrastructure bill spent? I'm a little skeptical that they're able to pull this one off. I'm afraid to say, but I do think it's a possibility.
Okay, I want one more domestic question, then we're going to go pick up speed and travel around the world at warp speed. But in terms of domestic supply chain, it's kind of a supply chain question with the potential lockdowns and or some subset of restrictions coming again over the winter. Do you see any legislation or policy impact in the short term that Biden could put in place that could impact transportation and trucking, retail supply, or even on-premise subsidies, just to help those sectors in particular?
Yeah. And sorry for my dog in the background there. So, look, I think that Biden's sort of national plan to deal with COVID is unclear at this point. He's already put together an impressive panel of experts, and they're going to try to work through some of the issues with COVID. But Biden's problem is the same problem that in some ways Trump faced. There's different will here, but because of the way the US system is constructed, it's very unclear the dividing line between federal and state authority on these matters. Trump was very willing in a lot of ways to lean on emergency authority in order to achieve some of his COVID policies. And that included, for example, the Defense Production Act, where he basically told some US firms to produce ventilators early on. They also went on a policy of actually seizing PPE equipment from some states and stores, to the point where we heard that state governors were actually hiding PPE, sort of inbound shipments designed for their hospitals, to make sure the federal government wasn't aware of the shipments. So I don't know that Biden's going to be willing to go that route, which in a lot of ways led to reactions on the left that Trump was an authoritarian. I don't think that's the case. I think that you're trying to manage a very difficult situation with the limited powers that the federal government formally leans upon, but with widespread emergency powers. So, things like a national mask mandate, I don't actually think that it's possible that Biden tries to implement that with executive authority. But I think more likely what Biden's going to do is get together experts, try to provide supports to states to ensure that they have the experts they need to make very clear COVID policies that are thought to be effective, to provide federal support for contact testing, tracing, which a lot of states don't even have still, to make sure that we can identify future waves in advance, and then to provide aid as necessary to those states and to small businesses within those states to make sure that they have the right protective equipment, that they can afford things like the plexiglass barriers to make sure that firms can stay open. I think in some of those areas, they're going to try to identify if there's still any vulnerabilities in those supply chains and production sort of stops, and get things working more efficiently. So I don't think it'll be like an immediate sea change. The tone will change from the federal center, but I think that it's going to be a much more limited impact from what the federal government can really do to force states to adjust their policies.
Okay. Let's now begin our around the world tour and foreign policy, and I'd like to, if we could, just take a region by region approach, given that's how many of our clients kind of organize their businesses. And we'll start with our close neighbors in Latin America, and let's start first and foremost with the Usmca, which was a pretty big accomplishment under the Trump administration. Any changes to that? How will the Biden administration approach Usmca?
Yeah. The interesting turn under the Republican Party under Trump is that historically the Democratic Party's been more reticent of free trade, and the Republican Party's been more free trade. And you've seen this kind of flip back and forth. NAFTA was originally basically negotiated and signed under Clinton. And now it's sort of the beginning of like the new left in American politics. That new left becomes rather centrist. And so that vulnerability with sort of the workers' parties and with sort of unions in the Midwest, Rust Belt, leads to, over time, the Reagan Democrats in the 80s, as well as a lot of Trump's sort of victory explained in 2016, was support by those Midwestern manufacturing workers who did, in a lot of ways, see jobs decline since the major trade deals of NAFTA, but even more so, I think that the data supports that the China shock was much more problematic for US workers than NAFTA has been. But anyway, Trump comes to power partly on a promise to redo NAFTA, which he calls, the worst deal ever done. He puts his trade representative in charge of negotiating that. There's a lot of back and forth threats, a lot of uncertainty. But what we end up with is the USMCA, which is a deal that looks a lot like NAFTA, but with some updated trade law that accounts for some things like the shift to digital markets, more cross-country digital services trade, as well as a bit of tightening on regulatory standards for things like chemical production and pharmaceuticals, which favors US companies and Canadian companies who have much better regulatory restrictions and sort of oversight processes for production of chemicals and pharmaceuticals. It also raises some of the local content requirements and the minimum wages for production of cars. And that is, again, designed to support US auto workers and Canadian auto workers to the detriment of an ongoing exodus of production of autos and final assembly of autos in Mexico. So that's basically USMCA. It's a revitalized NAFTA with mild improvements for both the US and Canada, but not a fundamentally different deal in a lot of ways. The Biden administration is going to keep USMCA. I don't think he wants to restart that wave. He might attempt to reopen through his US trading representative some of the chapters individually to get mildly more benefits for US workers. But I think as far as USMCA goes, that one's basically done and is not going to be the early priority of the Biden administration.
Staying in Latin America, just for one more question, what about trade policy with other countries in and around the region?
Yeah, under the Obama administration, and we think the Biden administration takes a lot of cues from this. There was actually a lot of sort of bilateral outreach from the US into Latin America. This was on the issue of development financing. So whereas the Trump administration sought to deal with the refugee crisis out of Guatemala, Ecuador, and El Salvador, not Ecuador, sorry, Guatemala and El Salvador, by basically forcing Mexico to police the border, the Obama administration tried to support sort of a stop in the refugee crisis by supporting and building the local government in those countries so that you wouldn't have a refugee crisis. So I think you'll see more of that bilateral style of engagement defining the Biden policy towards Central America, as well as towards a lot of South America, where the strategic concern is that the US needs to be more engaged with Latin America because of the active engagement by China in a lot of the region. So almost bilateral policy in Latin America, taking a trade and economic focus, almost to ensure that the US maintains its sort of close partnership with those countries against the rise of Chinese influence in the region. The only question marks.
We've heard some examples from clients of Chinese companies really using almost the Chinese government's balance sheet to buy their way into these markets, and so that's a very real issue for a lot of our clients in certain sectors.
Yeah, and it's very hard because in a lot of cases the acquisitions made by Chinese companies are strategic in nature or long-term in nature in a way that supports valuations for inorganic acquisitions that no Western firm could ever justify paying. And so we've heard that actually across the world in terms of a dearth of opportunities for Western firms to grow that way because Chinese firms are subsidized in a different way and basically acquire things that make no financial sense from a Western buying perspective. I will say that the one concern that we hear clients raise is about US policy towards Brazil. If the Biden administration goes all out on pursuing a sort of green foreign policy, meaning that bilateral negotiations will put climate change front and center, and compliance with more aggressive, improved climate change standards, reduced emission standards. And so the concern there is that the Biden administration will focus on Brazil's sort of handling and management of the rainforests, as well as sort of the rest of their domestic environmental infrastructure from a policy side, which is problematic compared to a lot of the rest of Latin America. So that is a point of concern, but I don't think that that's going to dominate the conversation from the U.S. side. I think they'll be more pragmatic.
Okay, and I had a question about immigration and policies, and specifically to MNCs, and you kind of touched upon that. So I'll move on if we can, because I want to make sure we get around the world. So I'm going to go all the way across to APAC now, and I wanted to start with China. And you mentioned China a little bit in our last segment there, but I do want to spend some time on China. And your base case is that we should expect that U.S.-China tensions are going to continue. Yep. And we also know that President-elect Biden has a Buy American plan. So with those facts kind of being stated, what, if any, shifts do you see in the approach to China regarding trade and tariffs, and how should our clients prepare? I mean, in many ways, this has been probably the single biggest issue for our clients, both in terms of demand as well as their supply chains and the investments that they've made in manufacturing, and all of that's really hit them in both ways. What happens in the next several years with regards to U.S. China and trade and tension there?
Yeah, so I think that it's important on this to separate out what we think is going to happen on the trade. So there's the trade side of the relationship that relates to the cross-border flow of goods and services between China and finance capital between China and the U.S., which is, in both countries' perspectives, mutually beneficial. So there we're talking about Chinese production of very low value add, low margin, generally low wage producing goods and services that flows over to the US, that mainly benefits the US consumer by offering product at very low price points. And that's partly why inflation in goods markets has been so low in the US for the past decade. And so consumer electronics, small consumer non-durable products, some consumer durables on the lower end of the value chain, but not so much in the US. Those sorts of things, Trump didn't really view those as strategic problems. So I think that a lot of the tensions on those issues, as well as the US flow westward of finance capital, some of their sort of business, especially the services economy, in which it's not really such a strategic imperative to retain like IP, but where the US is very efficient at sort of services production. I think both countries want to find a way to get those tariffs down, as well as agricultural tariffs on US products going to China, which hurts American farmers, but those are commoditized products that China can eventually buy elsewhere if it is forced to the detriment of US farmland prices and US farmers more generally. So I think there's that side of the equation, which, by the way, no economists really supported those tariffs. I think Peter Navarro, Trump's sort of China advisor, must be the only economist in the US who really believed that those kind of tariffs would lead to a rebound in US domestic manufacturing production. Other economists don't believe it, and it really didn't happen under the last 4 years of Trump. And there's no real signs to say it will. The nuance there is that on a very specific product category basis, there are some areas in which by shutting China out of the marketplace, the US was able to see a rebound in certain product code growth because the tariffs raised were so large that some US companies provided those products instead. So not every company in the US is going to view this the same way, but we're talking about in aggregate numbers for the entire US economy. These kind of trade restrictions, economists don't think they work. But the other side of this equation is the sort of strategic concerns. So the policies that were passed by the Commerce Department, adding certain items to the commercial control list of commerce that prevented the export due to concerns about national security or trying to preserve critical IP. Any actions taken by the Committee of Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, which was rebolstered, a lot of those actions to sort of approach China more as a strategic competitor and prevent some of the loss of IP and tech supremacy that the US has, those we don't think are going away. And so that's going to affect more clients on the sort of higher end of the spectrum, semiconductor producers, and people who produce electronics observation equipment, optical equipment. We think a lot of those restrictions probably stay in place. The nuance here, and I realize I've talked on this one a bit, I will say this is our events to watch for next year. And one of the events that we think could happen here with a 20% likelihood is this US-China partial reset. And what we mean by that is, while our base case is kind of that the Biden administration comes in immediately, we'll want to review what's happened with China and the US and really get its ducks in a row and try to figure out a real policy before unwinding any tariffs. The Biden administration also wants to work with China on a number of issues. Number one, it wants to relax tensions, which are basically at all-time highs. But it also wants to work with China on multilateral issues of mutual interest, like the North Korea situation, like getting Iran back to the negotiating table to get a new nuclear, probably expanded nuclear deal done. And it wants to lower tensions around some of the actions that might take place around Taiwan or Hong Kong, in which tensions are very high and uncertainty is high. So I do think that the Biden administration will view a lot of those low-wage consumer tariffs that were put up in later rounds. I think those are on the table for negotiating lower, in exchange for some movement by Beijing on some other issues. But I don't think there's any movement for short-term drops to any of those tech-based or national security implied tariffs.
Okay. We've got about 12 minutes left, so we're going to really try to do speed round here if we can. I'd stay in Asia real quick and briefly, but what can we expect in terms of engagement with other APAC countries, specifically, yeah. I would say India and then the Southeast Asian countries in terms of...
Yeah. So when Obama left office, one of his signature achievements was meant to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was basically a design of a regulatory regime and a trade regime that excluded China. That would include countries like India, Canada, sort of a broad-based network of countries that would basically force a regulatory regime, which China would need to comply to in order to make it efficient for them to produce domestic exports for those marketplaces. So as a way of trying to tie China into Western standards. The first thing Trump did when he entered office was kill TPP, which went on without him. And so TPP effectively exists without the US participation. I think the Biden administration tries to come back into Southeast Asia ex-China and East Asia ex-China and really say, look, we are back in the region. This is our strategic priority. We want to make sure that you guys feel safe, but also that we can benefit from trade with your countries in a way that benefits the US as well as benefits US multinationals operating in those countries. So I think you'll see an immediate re-engagement with India in particular to try to find more areas of mutual interest, despite any of the human rights concerns. I think India is a key country as well as a very powerful country from a lobbying perspective in the US. For Vietnam, I think that it's a question mark whether or not some of these recently imposed tariffs based on currency manipulation stay in place. I think the signpost to watch there, if that's a key business, is who Biden is appointing to the U.S. Trade Representative and the Treasury Office. He recently appointed to the U.S. Trade Rep, at least on the transition team, this guy named Brad Setzer, who's been a very active voice on analyzing whether or not fair trade competition is happening in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, especially Vietnam. And so I think tipping his hat, he does think there's some currency manipulation happening there that the Vietnamese government may have to respond to, possibly by letting a mild appreciation happen, which might slightly adjust the terms of trade for Vietnam in particular. So I do think it's a thing to watch, and we can start to develop strategies now for that.
Yeah, really interesting insight. And we know a lot of our clients have been looking at India both from a market investment perspective and also looking at Southeast Asia, not only from a demand side, but also for moving manufacturing and other things. So that sounds like it's a positive for those. All right, let's go to Western Europe quickly. We saw definite increased tension over the last 4 years with the U.S. On both the security and trade front. So quick answers there. What can we expect with the EU and also with the UK, and who are the likely winners in those moves?
Yeah, I think is Biden's first trip to Europe or to China? I think is a good question for framing, and I think his first trip's going to be to Europe. I think he will immediately resolve these tensions with the EU. I think he's going to drop those tariffs very swiftly that Trump imposed. He's going to reaffirm U.S. commitments to NATO. He's going to try to find ways to work with the EU on areas of mutual interest. That's especially in terms of human rights and democratization in Eastern Europe. But I think also on this issue of addressing Chinese structural competition, Germany's raised a lot of the same issues that U.S. firms have raised. And so I think there is a potential to try to start to do the multilateral approach to also address some of the issues of Chinese distortions that have impacted the global economy via the EU.
Okay, good. Staying in Europe for a second, what about Russia and Central and Eastern Europe? Specifically, what does a Biden presidency mean to relations with Russia, the outlook for the Russian economy, sanctions, currency?
Yeah.
Feels like Russia might be a net loser in a Biden presidency.
Yeah, so Biden definitely has a sort of very Catholic belief in sort of human rights and the sort of Catholic doctrine of democracy. It's not just because he's Catholic, it's ingrained in him. He's also, remember, a Cold Warrior in a sense. Like he was in the Senate during the Cold War. And so that was an informative part of his upbringing. Add to that the fact that Democrats in general have a lot of grievances against Russian electoral meddling, as well as the fact that the Trump administration, by and large, tried to go pretty light on Russia. And Russia's been doing things in the region that have been very problematic from a U.S. foreign policy perspective. So meddling in Ukraine continues. We've seen repeated reports of poisoning of journalists who are in opposition to the sort of Putin regime, as well as some other actions in the region. So I think the perspective from our team is that you're going to pretty rapidly see new sanctions imposed on Russia. That will probably push the ruble slightly down. A lot of that's, I think, already priced in, but there's sort of potential for more pain there. Outside of Russia, you're going to see the U.S. try to impose some support for regimes in the region that are at risk of losing democracy or are autocratic. And so I think you'll see some of a policy impetus towards Ukraine, even though it's a bit out of the U.S.'s orbit right now. Possibly some action against Hungary, though I think they'll let the EU work. I think they'll work with the EU on that one. And then Belarus and Turkey would be the two main question marks, as both countries have seen sort of recent autocratic, widely reported issues that I think compel some U.S. activity. Turkey is actually my main question mark there, and I think Turkish firms with a big presence in Turkey really need to do a deep rethink, even as the currency collapses, about what the long-term future of Turkey in that region looks like as the U.S. sort of changes its approach to Erdogan.
Yeah, that's actually a good segue because we're going to finish our tour with kind of Middle East and Africa. And so I did have a question on Turkey, and a lot of our clients have major exposure in Turkey, and so it sounds like it's going to be tough sledding in the near term in terms of relations with Turkey and the implications for business there.
Yeah, Turkey's always been a weird bridge, and so what you have with Turkey right now is obviously also Nagorno-Karabakh breaking out again is no accident. There's kind of a new, from a strategic perspective, a new great game happening kind of between Russia, Turkey, and some of the Arab states in that sort of part of the world around the Caspian Sea, where neither the US, China, nor the EU has a lot of strategic influence right now. I think Turkey is tough because obviously the economy is sliding, and Erdogan is doing himself no favors from the perspective of the international finance community. He suspended offshore trading effectively of Turkish lira about 3 months ago and generated a lot of panic and losses. That means they're not going to be able to get swap lines to help support the currency in a lot of ways. And because of the sort of autocratic shift from a pretty pro-democratic state more and more towards an autocratic regime in a lot of ways, it's going to be hard sledding, as you say, for them to get financing from the US, EU, or IMF institutions in the way they may have used to enjoy it. So lots of concerns there. And the problem is they're also involved in a lot of regional conflicts, especially on their southern border. So as the Arab world appears to be sort of adjusting their own policies. We've seen the sort of Israel UAE breakthrough. I think there's some potential for more breakthroughs in that region to occur. Turkey doesn't really know where it fits. And I think that that's a very dangerous place to be with a sort of populist leader.
And another country that probably is not sure where it fits given some of this normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab nations is Iran. And obviously, the Iran nuclear deal was a major achievement of the Obama-Biden administration. President Trump, just like with the Paris Accord, kind of immediately walked away from the Iran nuclear deal. Will Biden return to it? And frankly, is it too late to put the genie back in the bottle? I read in the journal today that Iran has something like 15 times the amount of uranium that it had at the start of the deal. Are we really too far gone here? And how to think about that?
Yeah, I think it's tough. So here, Biden has said repeatedly he wants to return to the Iran deal, the JCPOA. So the expectation is pretty swiftly upon entering office, what he's going to do is get all the signatories to the JCPOA back together and try to figure out how to put it back together. The issue, I think, is that there's an expectation that Biden will try to expand the JCPOA before he signs on to it, including some other issue areas like ballistic missiles. And that the question is he going to offer more carrots to Iran in order to get more things added to the JCPOA, or is he going to approach the negotiations from the perspective of sanctions have been crippling your economy amid COVID? That's also the economy's worse. Basically, give us more things, or we won't relieve these sanctions. And I don't know if he'll take a hard tact or not as it comes to that question. I think he'll take a moderate tact. I think he wants the deal put back together. The Europeans definitely want that. So I think that's an area where he might sort of cede to their influence a little bit. So actually I think the outlook for that one's pretty good. The issue is that if he wants to renegotiate, these deals are complicated. They usually require multiple rounds, and COVID makes it hard to meet in person. And the US and Iran don't have full diplomatic relations. So a lot of these meetings sort of had to happen in person in Switzerland or via various interlocutors. And so I think it might be hard to get it done in 2021 if he really wants sort of more agreements to be part of the deal. But I do think he's going to work that way. So tension should cool down.
All right. Last question, and I want you to answer it very quickly, but I want you to put your head of international hat on. So you're running international for a large multinational, and you're going to run 3 different multinationals in the next 30 seconds. One is a B2B company, one is a B2C company, and one is a healthcare company. So you're head of international. If you had to make an incremental investment over the next 4 years in one part of the world to capture outsized growth, where would it be? So let's start B2B.
Yep. B2B, I think you still want to be looking at East Asia, especially Southeast Asia. I think that the growth trends there, especially looking at Indonesia, India, where it's, despite government issues, a priority of the government. I think in terms of top line revenue growth, that's where you want to play if you can figure out a way to keep your margins in check to generate good bottom line profit. That's where I look for growth.
Okay, B2C.
B2C, I'm going to look at Latin America, partly because the outlook for the region is so depressed right now. I think you're going to see a longer term recovery in Latin America, but if you target the right sort of medium to high income, largely urban resident populations that are less affected by COVID, that's where you're going to generate some of this good growth.
Okay, and healthcare. Healthcare, the answer might be everywhere, but if you had to pick, where would it be?
Yeah, I think Central and Eastern Europe. So especially the sort of parts of Central and Eastern Europe that are not part of the EU. So we're talking there about sort of the Polands, Hungaries of the world, where you have pretty good currency stability, pretty good revenue growth due to the reliance of Western European supply chains on them for essential parts, that you probably won't see sort of large unemployment losses, and a pretty sort of aging population where those services are in high demand and will increase with higher income levels over the next couple of years.
Okay, interesting. Ryan, we're up against time. Thank you so much. We could go on for hours, as you know, but thanks so much for this excellent, insightful discussions. Thanks to our listeners for taking the time to join us and for their questions. And if you have continued questions, please send them through. As a reminder, Frontier View clients can speak to Ryan or any member of the Frontier View research team at any time. You just have to schedule time for your client relationship director. And all of Frontier View's research, award-winning Frontier data and analyst insights are available and always updated on the Frontier View desktop and mobile applications. This concludes today's webcast, and we look forward to speaking with you again very soon. Have a great day.